Well, good morning and welcome to the AgNow Roundup. My name is Dave Deacon. Sunflower production flourishes in the United States because it's a hardy plant that thrives in parts of the Great Plains, and that is because of the region's abundant sunlight and well-suited soils. Their seeds are rich in healthy oils and proteins, making them ideal for human foods and livestock feed. This morning, we'll discuss the sunflower's production in the upper Great Plains, specifically the Nebraska Panhandle, with the University of Nebraska's Dr. Cody Creech. But first, let's take a look at the weather across the country with meteorologist Matt Makins.
Matt Makins here with this week's AgNow weather report. Fighting off the crud, so bear with me. Let's get through a quick weather update and then I'll grab a cough drop. We have the bullseye of moisture headed to the southern plains. That's going to be the biggest event of this week. Also some water in California and up to coastal sections of Washington, and a lot of water from Florida up the eastern seaboard. It's going to be that Texas moisture though, and I say Texas, it's also New Mexico, southern Colorado, and Oklahoma, but the focus of the system is going to be on Texas, and that's going to be Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and for parts of Texas and eastern Oklahoma, that may go into parts of the weekend as well. Quite a bit of shower activity there. As you look at the southeast, that storm system, which provided the water near Florida, gets together with some tropical moisture over Florida and then races up the eastern seaboard. So again, looking at some impressive totals here. For sections of Florida, South Florida, we're anywhere from 1 to 3 to 4 inches. Same for the west coast, there, extreme coastal areas, but fly that map in. So here we have Lamar, Colorado, Dodge City, Kansas, on down to the south. Almost into San Antonio, we have totals at least 1 inch. And then the bullseye that's around Amarillo, Lubbock, up to Childress or so, the probabilities there of getting 3 inches are pretty substantial considering the time of year. So 1 to 3 inches, very likely in this swath, may cover parts of eastern New Mexico as well. A lot of water. In terms of snowfall, this system does have some cold air with it, but it's not a classic cold system. So most of that, especially in Texas and Oklahoma, most of that is going to be as rainfall. But you get into southwestern Kansas, the very, very tiniest corner, if you will, of the panhandles, and then most of New Mexico and southern Colorado will have some snowfall. For areas around Santa Fe, up to Raton, the Raton Mesa, we're looking at several inches of snow out of the system, and the same for southern Colorado. Into the San Juans, they've been kind of in a water or a snow deficit, and from a water resources standpoint, nice to see a bullseye have some very healthy snowfall totals for the San Juans. Again, that's our water reservoir for next year. As far as the cold, I kind of mentioned it's not a classically very cold system, but there will be some cold temperatures with it. For a lot of us in the Rocky Mountains, the northern plains, freezing this time of the year, that happens every night basically. But this map shows the probability of hitting freezing over the next 10 days, and it goes well down into southern New Mexico into western Texas. So around El Paso, there's a chance that folks will hit freezing. Around in north of Dallas to Oklahoma City, Jackson, Montgomery, Atlanta, Columbia, kind of on the edge, if you will, of the possibility of hitting freezing. Again, this map shows you the probability in reds, yellows, etc. of hitting freezing. A lot of us do every night, but a lot of folks down to the south do not. So wanted to raise your attention to that. All right, I'm going to grab the cough drop, save your ears. We'll see you next week with a hopefully healthier weatherman. Matt Makins here.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. When we think of sunflowers, we think of tall photogenic plants with heads full of seeds and many health benefits. And most of the nation's sunflowers are grown in the upper Great Plains, and today we're talking about sunflower production across the Panhandle of Nebraska with Dr. Cody Creech of the University of Nebraska. Thanks for going on with us, Dr. Creech, and I guess let's start out with an overview of Nebraska's sunflower production.
Yeah, so sunflowers of course, have historically been grown here in Nebraska, primarily here in the Panhandle of Nebraska. Acreage can vary year to year depending on the type of moisture we have available to us, but we typically fall around that 50,000 acre mark, sometimes as high as 75, 80,000. But just depends on the year. A lot of folks like sunflowers because they do well in our environment, and so I think they'll always have a place in our cropping systems out here.
Are they a rotation crop, or are they a primary crop used as a I can't even speak. Are they primarily a cash crop or a rotation crop?
I would see them as more of, well, it's going to be a little bit of both. So they are not they are not the cornerstone of most people's crop rotations. That still remains wheat, winter wheat in our area here. However, when we include sunflowers in our crop rotations, we typically see a really positive benefit when it comes to profitability of our rotations. And so if we move away from wheat fallow and get into a more diverse crop rotation that includes sunflowers, we often see that bottom line improve quite a bit.
What does a sunflower crop do to enhance the soil quality?
So one thing I like about encouraging, or one reason I encourage folks to think about sunflowers is primarily because of that deep taproot that the sunflowers
Right.
have. And so if we only use small grains that have a really shallow root system, there's a lot of additional moisture and nutrients that perhaps over time have been leached out of that shallow soil profile that are no longer accessible to those small grain crops. And so when we are able to include something like sunflowers in our rotation, we're able to bring some of those nutrients back up and use those, as well as some of that moisture that might be out of the reach of some of those smaller grains. And so I really like, on occasion, putting a crop like sunflowers into the mix, just because I feel like we're going to be able to access more of those nutrients that may be outside of our reach in some, with some of our other crops.
You're a dryland crop specialist. How do sunflowers work into a dryland area like the Panhandle of Nebraska?
Yeah, so typically we like to see sunflowers going in behind wheat, ideally. That the wheat will provide good residue cover, which helps suppress weeds and other things, and conserve soil moisture. Typically going out of on the back end of the sunflowers, I would prefer most years to fallow because of how well sunflowers do of pulling moisture out of the soil. We often need that year to kind of help recharge some of that soil moisture before we go back into winter wheat. It's not always required, depending on the year, but we do see the sunflowers are pretty good at pulling that moisture out of the soil, and so we need some time to typically recharge that soil afterward.
What kind of weed pressure do you see, and even insect pressure, in the typical Nebraska sunflower season?
I would say we see what would be common in most areas. We see a lot of late emerging grassy weeds, and so our typical program will be to go in and do some type of a burn down with glyphosate and maybe a Spartan product of some kind to provide a little bit of pre-emergent control. However, what we see is just due to the kind of the slow growth early on of sunflowers, and it takes them a while to close that canopy. That pre-emergent application typically breaks down, and as we get some late season rains, we'll see those weeds coming up, and those are going to be really any warm season weed that we have out here. Some of those grassy weeds, we put some of the millet or some of the sunflowers would go in behind proso millet, and so we might have some volunteer proso millet coming up. Mm-hmm. We're going to have some tumble pigweed, maybe some red root pigweed out there as well. Russian thistle might pop up, and so some of those weeds that just like to come up late, we have to think about maybe how to properly manage those to keep them out, under control late in the season.
With so many crops across the Great Plains, you do have the insects, but then also diseases. Do we see that any of those pressures with the sunflower crop?
Yeah, we still see a lot of disease pressure with our sunflower crops. We have a plant pathologist here that's really focused on those diseases, and what we do see, like many areas, we have I don't know if the hailstorms just like to come see us all the time, but we get our fair share of hailstorms out here, and like most sunflower crops, when they get wounded from hail, that really opens them up to just an assortment of diseases. And so we don't see like widespread issues with diseases, but if we do have a hailstorm come through that seems to really open those plants up to disease issues, and we could see issues then. Otherwise, it's not typically something that we have to worry significantly about unless we have a hailstorm come in.
You mentioned that a lot of sunflowers are planted following a wheat in a rotation. What is the typical growing season from planting to harvest?
Yeah, so in this area, we like to get our sunflowers in the latter part of May or first part of June, and then they'll be harvested most often the first part of October, if weather permits. We have a very limited market in Nebraska, or access to markets, and so that's our ability to get sunflowers off early gives us a better window and marketability of a lot of our sunflower crop in this area.
What would you say to a producer who's been on the fence about planting, getting into sunflowers? Because there's a lot that goes into it. You don't just put it in the ground and then hope for rain. There are multiple things that go into it. What advice would you give one of the producers?
I would prefer they start backwards in this area and start thinking about first, what am I going to do with this crop when I grow it? In Nebraska, it typically means you have to truck it 3 to 4 hours to find a market for it. We do have a local birdseed processor that uses quite a bit for birdseed, but they can only take so much, and so for most of our producers, that means on-farm storage is really important, because they have to be able to store it at least for a while before they can get it moved to a market. And so that's the first step, is think about where I'm going to be able to take this crop. How am I going to store this crop until I can get it shipped? And then the next piece would be to start thinking about harvest capabilities. Oftentimes we have to have at least some adjustments to our equipment if we're going to harvest sunflowers, and so working through that process as well as understanding how I'm going to harvest it, and making a plan there. And then once we have kind of that back end figured out, then I think we can start to think about the front end, and that's going to be making plans as far as which fields are going to be best for us. If we're going in behind a winter wheat or a proso millet crop, identifying those fields, finding the right genetics that are going to do well in this area and using those, and then understanding how we're going to manage those pests. We already mentioned some of the weed and pest pressures. That typically means we have to have a herbicide plan in place. We have to have contacts in place, so when we need a spray for weevil, that we have that kind of connection, and that we're ready to go when that window opens up. And so there is some planning that's going to be involved, but it's nothing that's going to be insurmountable if we don't if we can make those right connections with folks who maybe have that experience already.
What kind of research are you working on right now for sunflower producers across the Panhandle of Nebraska?
Yeah, so we've done a few projects primarily focused on weed control in sunflowers. We've received funding from the National Sunflower Association to look at some products, and along that we've teamed up with researchers in other states like Kansas, where we can get multiple sites put in. The first project that we looked at, we were really interested in seeing how we can improve our late season weed control. And so I previously mentioned the challenge we have with sunflowers, that we put down a pre at planting and that might run out of steam after a few weeks, and then we get a lot of weeds coming up later. And so the first project that we looked at was using a product like Zidua as a lay-by coming in later maybe 3-4 weeks after planting and laying down another pre-emergent product like Zidua to hopefully extend that window of control in our sunflower crop. And I would say that approach is it worked. It's a pretty decent approach. The next one we looked at, or that we wanted to take a stab at, was, perhaps we can use cover crops to provide some of that weed control.
Right. Again,
understanding that we don't have a lot of options in sunflowers, and so anything we can do is going to be helpful. And so we looked at the termination timings as far as when to terminate that. How many weeks before planting or right at planting, and what that impact might be on the weed emergence as well as the sunflower yields. And it's kind of catch-22. The longer you let that cover crop grow, the better your weed control. But we started to see a reduction in our sunflower yield, and so finding that right balance, which turned out to be terminating that cover crop about maybe 2 to 3 weeks before planting, is going to be the best situation. We don't want it to get too close to competing with the sunflowers directly. But really interesting work. There are options for us, and I think that's what growers like to hear, is that there's possible solutions that they might be able to consider that can address some of these issues that they've been having with the weed control in their crop.
It's great that you mentioned cover crops in there. Just kind of off subject, are you seeing a lot of interest in cover crops across your area?
There does remain a lot of interest in cover crops, especially with some of the support that like the NRCS offers producers in that world. Unfortunately, in our area, like many areas in the high plains, water remains our limiting factor, and cover crops can use moisture that can otherwise be used for a crop. And so I do feel that there's a really important balance that needs to be struck with cover crops. There are benefits, there are opportunities for them to be used effectively, but it needs to be pretty strategic, and it needs to be on the correct year. Using cover crops in a drought year doesn't make a lot of sense for our areas, and using cover crops when you have such water limited environments like we have out here, you need to find ways to gain other values beyond just the soil health. And that might mean if you can use it for grazing cattle, or if you can use it as some type of forage, so you can gain some value from it. Otherwise, it's hard to make cover crops always pencil in our area just because of the water situation.
Right. Well, thank you so much for going on with us, Dr. Creech with the University of Nebraska. We sure appreciate it.
I appreciate the invitation.
If there's something on the show that you'd like to learn more about, visit our website, agnowtv.com. And while you're there, check out our social media and sign up for our email. You can also find links to download our AgNow TV app. It's all free of charge, and it's at agnowtv.com. From our farm to your farm, I'm Dave Deacon for AgNow.